Good afternoon, everyone. If you don't have headphones on right now, you might find it a little bit easier to hear with that. My name is Pam Pearson. I'm the director of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. Welcome to the Cryosphere Pavilion. I'd like to welcome especially those who are watching online and in the Stockholm and Geneva hubs. Time permitting, there will be a Q&A afterwards. So we'll give a chance to those at the hubs to ask questions first. And you're welcome to also put questions in the chat, and then those of you in the audience will also have a chance to do so. I want to welcome you to this 50 by 30 coalition event. 50 by 30 refers to the needed 50% by 2030 reductions needed in order to keep the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement in sight. There are very few countries, unfortunately, that currently have 2030 goals that are 50 by 30 consistent. But as you'll hear a little bit later, the special report on 1.5 degrees made it very clear that globally we need to reduce emissions 50% by the year 2030. And then the additional 50%, roughly speaking, needs to take place over the ensuing 20 years. If we don't make this goal, and again, very few governments are aiming at this near-term goal, it will be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to remain close to 1.5 degrees. So 50 by 30 is a coalition of cryosphere research organizations from around the world, everywhere from New Zealand to Colorado in the American West, that feel it's very important to raise this science, to raise the need for these 50% reductions, because for cryosphere, overshoot simply is not an option. That is why our motto in 50 by 30 is that there's no negotiating with the melting point of ice. That is simply a physical reality, and that physical reality is in many ways the most compelling reason why we need to make the 1.5 degree goal the 50 by 30 goal. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joeri Rogelj from the Grantham Institute, and an Ipcc author on both the AR5, the fifth assessment, the sixth assessment, and also a coordinating lead author then on the special report on 1.5 degrees of warming. So Joeri, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. And also from my side, welcome to this event. To start off, I want to give a bit of the context in terms of where we stand globally for 50 by 30 pathways. Why are we talking about a reduction of 50% by 2030? And where do we stand today in achieving that reduction? So what I will draw on from the beginning is the 1.5 degree special report of the IPCC. This was published in 2018, and it was one of the landmark reports where we looked at what is the scientific evidence underpinning the pathways through which we can limit warming to 1.5 or close to 1.5. And there were a few key characteristics of those pathways that really came to the fore. And here you can see them on this slide. On the right-hand side, you can just see the pathways in terms of global carbon dioxide emissions. They start in 2010, 2020, where we are today. And then you can see that all of these pathways show a very steep reduction in carbon dioxide emissions in the next decade. Actually, across all the pathways, they show a 40 to 60% reduction by 2030 relative to 2010 levels. This is for carbon dioxide. This figure for all greenhouse gases, including methane, nitrous oxide, it is roughly the same number by 2030. The second key milestone in these pathways is that it doesn't stop with a near-term reduction. That near-term reduction is absolutely essential, but the second big milestone is a net zero carbon dioxide emissions by mid-century, roughly. And that you can see here marked with B. This is net zero carbon dioxide. Net zero total greenhouse gas emissions are reached slightly later, around 2 decades later, that in the around 2070. You can also see that in the long term, in order to slowly reduce emissions again or reduce temperatures again from their peak warming, all these pathways reach net negative carbon dioxide emissions, which basically tries to reverse global warming from its peak level. But at the same time, because of those steep reductions in the near term, they also make sure that peak warming is kept as low as possible. Now, these are just modeling results. And so the question is, what is required to achieve these deep reductions? And also there, the IPCC actually looked at what would be required to reduce those emissions so deeply. The IPCC wrote a lot about this, slightly too much for a 10 minutes presentation. So let me just say some of the key insights there. Well, to limit warming to 1.5, we need rapid, far-reaching changes on an unprecedented scale. And each of those bold words, they actually mean something very specific in the context of 1.5 degree. Rapid means that within the next decade, we need to see changes. If we don't see steep reductions in the next decade, we will have emitted the carbon budget for 1.5. So keeping warming to 1.5 is already out of the window by then. Far-reaching means that we need to have change and emission reductions in all of the sectors. Nobody is off the hook. We need to change the way in which we produce our energy, in the way we use our land, the way we transport ourselves, or the way we design our cities, and finally also the amount of products we use and how we produce them. So no sector is off the hook here. And finally, on an unprecedented scale, it really means also geographically and socially, nobody is off the hook. It needs to have involvement of all countries, all regions, all stakeholders, both poor and vulnerable populations, and of course also the powerful lobbies that of established industries that need to change in order to limit warming to 1.5. Then, of course, that is what we should be aiming at. Now, where are we? And here I'm drawing on a report that just came out last week. It's part of an annual series of the UN Environment Programme called the Emissions Gap Report. This year we have a kind of a bit more provocative front page. The heat is on, a world of climate promises not yet delivered. And so here on the left-hand side, this is global greenhouse gas emissions. What we do every year in that report is we show where emissions should be going. Here at the bottom range to limit warming to 2 degrees, 1.8 or 1.5, and then where they are heading actually based on current policies. They're in the dark Bordeaux, and then based on conditional and unconditional pledges in orange and purple. And you can see that without too much effort, you can see that there is a large gap between where global emissions are currently going by 2030 and where they should be heading to be on that pathway that doesn't stop in 2030, but continues further to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. The current updated emissions already improve slightly from the previous version of NDCs that we had as part of the Paris Agreement, but not yet enough. And that is also why this meeting is so important. Finally, the question is often asked, are these changes feasible? These are massive changes. These are very demanding from governments, from people, from industries. And so is it possible? And this was a question that was also asked to the IPCC, to the 1.5 degree special report. And if the IPCC is asked a simple question, then we come back with a difficult answer. And the difficult answer is that there are 6 dimensions of feasibilities that should be ticked in order for us to be able to say that something is feasible or not. And some of those dimensions, we as scientists can tick ourselves because we have the scientific evidence to respond to these. We can say that within the laws of chemistry and physics, geophysical feasibility, we can limit warming to 1.5. We know that within the carrying capacity of our planet, we can limit warming to 1.5. We have the technologies actually available. We know how to do it technologically. So also there, we scientists can respond positively. And we also know that it actually doesn't really cost that much. It's really an investment with some upfront investment that will pay itself back quite rapidly, to be honest. However, the two last boxes here at the bottom are two boxes where we as scientists do not have the answers. And that are boxes whether we can socially and culturally make the changes that are required. We need to change some of our behaviors. We need to use more public transport. We need to change some of our dietary preferences in order to reduce emissions. And the second one is whether we will make the policy decisions that are required to make this happen in the real world. And here I have this finger pointing into this room because it is this forum now, well, not just this forum, but many fora. This is one of them where decisions indeed need to be taken to make this reality and to make this feasible from the scientific evidence into action into the real world. And with that, thank you very much. And I would like to hand over to my colleague, Jonathan.
Hi. So my name is Jonathan Bamber. I'm director of the Bristol Glaciology Centre, and I'm also a professor at Technical University of Munich. Joeri's just explained to you how we can achieve 50 by 30 or how we can stay under 1.5 degrees. I'm going to say a few words about why we have to do that, why it's absolutely imperative for civilization. I'm not going to bombard you with lots of facts and figures. I don't think that's terribly useful. I'm going to keep this relatively short and hopefully time for questions and for you to have an opportunity to ask the things that you need to know rather than me guessing what you need to know. So that's kind of how I'm going to frame it. And just as a way of introduction, I've been studying ice for about 4 decades now. I did my PhD on glaciers in Svalbard, that's in the Norwegian Arctic. And I've witnessed with my own eyes the transformation in glaciers and ice cover in that region. And so I've been on a kind of personal journey as well as a scientific journey over the last 40 years, not 40 decades. And there are 3 parts of the cryosphere that I want to focus on that are real drivers and drivers for this imperative, drivers for why we have to stay below 1.5. There are others in the climate system and there are other parts of the cryosphere, but I think these are the most relevant now. And the first of those is Arctic permafrost. So almost all the permafrost around the world resides in the Arctic. There is enough carbon stored in Arctic permafrost to raise global temperatures on their own by 3 degrees. So if we stop emitting tomorrow, there's enough to raise global temperatures by 3 degrees. And that, obviously the implications of that are pretty disastrous. And the point about Arctic permafrost is that it has a strong positive feedback. Permafrost is frozen ground, permanently frozen ground. When it starts to thaw, which it's been doing, it releases that carbon in both the form of methane, which is 25 times more, has stronger effect than CO2 and as CO2 as well. And if we go above 1.5 degrees and Arctic permafrost starts to thaw extensively, you get a positive feedback. It warms, you get biological activity below the surface, which keeps it warmer, and you get a feedback that basically you can't stop. And if Arctic permafrost thaws and it releases that carbon, we're stuck with that process for not decades, not centuries, but millennia to recover the carbon stock in the Arctic. I mean, it is a sort of profoundly serious threshold that we must not pass. The second one is glaciers, mountain glaciers around the world. They're possibly, well, no, definitely not in the UK, but for many regions, they're a really important water resource. They're important for tourism. They're a beautiful environment. And again, if we exceed 1.5 degrees, there are regions of the world, particularly tropical glaciers and low latitude glaciers, places like the Alps, where we're going to see almost complete loss of glacier cover by 2100. And that has very serious implications for communities in, say, tropical areas like the Andes, for example. And for those to recover, we're talking about centuries, multiple centuries to grow back glaciers. The third, which I think has important implications for all of humanity, is something called the West Antarctic ice sheet. Now, Antarctica is the biggest ice mass on the planet by a factor 10. It's 10 times bigger than Greenland. The West Antarctic ice sheet is the bit on the left with the peninsula coming down, and it's resting on bedrock that is up to 2.5 kilometers below sea level. Okay, so it's what's called a marine ice sheet, and its particular geometry means that it has an instability in it. It's called something called the marine ice sheet instability. And if we push the West Antarctic ice sheet a little bit too far, we prod it too much, and it passes this critical threshold, then humanity is committed to at least 3.5 meters of sea level rise from West Antarctica alone. Now, the timescale for that is something that depends on future emissions and the trajectory of climate. Nonetheless, that is something that we're committed to, and that commitment, we're talking multiple millennia. There's no turning back, not on a human timescale, for that kind of committed sea level rise. And 3.5 meters, that's it's a sort of unthinkable sea level rise. Just to put it in context, 2 meters of sea level rise will displace 630 million people now. Okay, so that's 150 times more people than was displaced during the Syrian refugee crisis, and we all know what the political consequences and fallout of that were. So I think those thresholds we just cannot pass for the sake of humanity. And that's actually, I think, all I want to say. I'll stop there because I want to ensure there's lots of time for questions. Okay.
All good. Okay, well, I'd like to thank Pam for the opportunity to come and present today on 1.5 degree, national 1.5 degree pathways for cryosphere relevant countries. And the reason why it's important to have these 1.5 degree pathways at the national level is to gauge whether targets and policies of these countries are aligned with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree goal. So I'll just give a quick rundown of the structure of the talk today. I'll give an introduction to these downscaled modeled emissions pathways, then look at some results from 3 countries that are part of an upcoming briefing that we're doing on subarctic countries and 1.5 degree emissions pathways. And then put these model pathways into a broader equity context as well, which is really important. So as Joeri's already presented, in order to get these national level 1.5 degree pathways, we need to downscale from IAMs, from integrated assessment model emissions pathways. And what we're interested in particular is these economy-wide greenhouse gas emission pathways. And so IAMs use socioeconomic and climate data to produce global and regional scenarios that have emissions pathways that correspond to various temperature ranges. And what we're interested in particular are these 1.5 degree compatible emissions pathways. And this is a graphic that Joeri used as well. It's the full set of 1.5 degree compatible global emissions pathways from the special report on 1.5 degrees from the IPCC. And we can downscale these pathways to the national level using national energy data and also socioeconomic projections, so GDP and population growth projections. And what we do, climate analytics, we take this full set of emissions pathways and we filter out the ones that are considered to have unsustainable levels of carbon dioxide removal. So, for example, biomass with carbon capture and storage. And from that reduced subset of pathways, when we take the the median to the 5th percentile. So basically the most ambitious half of those pathways. And that's how we create these temperature ranges. So just introduce the upcoming work that we have with these 3 countries that we're looking at. So it's a briefing looking at subarctic countries and ensuring that they are 1.5 degree compatible. So we're looking at Scotland, Sweden, and Canada in particular. And the briefing will outline emissions ranges for various temperatures for each country, and then highlight where, for those countries, their targets and policies are either insufficient or where they are aligned, in fact, with the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. And then it also places it in context of localized cryosphere impacts as well. So of the 3 countries, Scotland is the most ambitious. It's got a very strong 2030 target, 75% below 1990. It's a world-leading target. And a 2045 net zero target, which is also world-leading, especially when you consider that the projected emissions from the land use sector and forestry are projected to be positive in the coming decades. So that makes it even harder to achieve. You've got to go further. You've got to account for these emissions too. It's not a sink. So at the end of last year, Scotland updated their climate change plan, and in that plan there was a modelled emissions pathway that showed sectoral emissions reductions that achieves these very ambitious targets, the 2030 target. But what's needed now is to see that the policies are being implemented and produced to achieve that emissions pathway that's now been modelled. And one thing that was missing, or that is missing, is a projection of emissions under current policies, so that it's really clear sort of how far there is to go. It's one thing to sort of map out, well, this is where we need to go, but it's also it's very useful to have that reference point to say, well, where are we now, and how far do we need to go still? So I thought it'd be useful to make a bit of a comparison with Scotland and the UK, because UK is it's been sort of touted in the media as a leader on climate change, and they do have a number of ambitious policies and targets. But just to put things into perspective, I thought it would be useful to compare Scotland, because they do have a number of targets and policies that are actually more ambitious than the UK. So UK is sort of out in front of the UK in that regard. So as I mentioned, the 2030 target of 75% is higher than the 68% of the UK. They've got a net zero target that will be reached in 5 years before, in 2045 versus 2050. Emissions-free heating in new buildings 1 year before, in 2024. And then a very ambitious goal to create a zero emission rail network by 2035. And then just very recently, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, has come out opposing new oil and gas exploration, something that the UK government has as yet not been willing to do. So Scotland, in a lot of ways, is really showing the rest of the world that very high levels of ambition are possible. And for that reason, Scotland really is a prime candidate to join the 50 by 30 coalition, which is a coalition of governments and research institutions, as Pam has mentioned, that is aligned with this goal, this need to reduce emissions by at least 50% by 2030. And with these world-leading targets and policies in place, Scotland would be a welcome addition to further this goal. I'll just quickly go through the other 2 countries that will be included in this upcoming briefing. So Sweden is also a 50 by 30 member, and they also have a 2045 net zero target, which is quite ambitious. But what's missing for Sweden is an economy-wide 2030 target. So they have sectoral targets. They have a transport sector target. They have non-emissions trading scheme related emissions target. But in order to sort of compare countries appropriately and to be able to gauge, where they're at with regards to these 1.5 degree compatible emissions ranges, you really need an economy-wide target. And so that's something that Sweden really, I think, needs to address as a matter of priority to to make sure that they enable sort of the gauge of where they're at and whether they're 1.5 degree compatible. And as you can see, the current policies at the moment, if other countries made similar efforts, would lead to between 2 and 3 degrees of warming. So it's one thing to have, you know, an ambitious net zero target, but you also need to really make it clear that that those policies are in place and that you're on the way. And at the moment, yeah, it's not the case. Another thing that's important. So as Scotland has the climate change plan and that modelled emissions pathway, it's important that Sweden sort of maps out, well, here are our planned policies, and this is where it's going to get us. Because, you know, as you saw, at least with the Scottish modelled emissions pathway, if they achieve that, then it's clear to see that is on a 1.5 degree trajectory. But at the moment, Sweden hasn't produced that, so it's not clear with the policies that they are proposing to put in place whether that's the case. And then the third country covered by this briefing is Canada. Now, Canada has produced some strengthened targets recently, have updated their 2030 target quite substantially. But again, as you can see, it's still not 1.5 degree compatible yet. A minimum of 54% below 1990 levels by 2030 would be the minimum they would need to achieve that. That's excluding LULUCF emissions. And then in the revised climate plan that they released, the planned policies that they have outlined, again, as you can see, it's first of all, it's not quite getting them to their 2030 target, and it's also not 1.5 degree compatible. So, you know, this newly elected Trudeau government, it's got a prime opportunity now, and I would say a mandate to increase the ambition of these targets and these policies and their target to really make sure that they are 1.5 degree compatible. It's one thing to have a 2050 target, which they've also just legislated and put in place. You know, net zero by 2050. It's a commendable target, but you need to be on track to achieve that, and you need to, you know, have a target that's also strong enough in the medium term, so 2030, to really, you know, you need to be within this green shaded area the whole way through. It's not enough to just have a net zero target in 2050. So one thing that's really important when we talk about these modeled emissions pathways, always need to be putting it into an equity context, because what a country does domestically in terms of what it sets as its target and what it achieves with its policies, it's just one part of the story. You really also need to make sure, if you're a wealthy country, that you're contributing adequately to global climate finance efforts. You know, without, you know, sufficient assistance to developing countries that also really need to reduce their emissions, we're just not going to be able to get to that 1.5 degree goal. And so, you know, as you see here on the right, it's sort of different conceptualizations of equity considerations, and you know, these model pathways, they don't take these into consideration. So what you need to do then is find a way of quantifying that. And so there are different ways that you can do that. There's different platforms out there. The Climate Action Tracker is a very prominent one that tries to rate not just what a country is doing domestically, but whether or not they are contributing their fair share to global climate mitigation efforts. And so I've used the example here of Germany because it's a Climate Action Tracker country, and we've got the modeled domestic pathways here as well. And you can see that green range on the left, it's much higher than what is the 1.5 degree fair share range down there. It's actually negative, right? So the difference there, that would be what they would need to contribute in global climate finance to get them to that fair share contribution. And that applies to all wealthy countries that do have the ability and the wealth to contribute those funds to help developing countries also reduce their emissions. So it's always important to consider that when we're talking about these things. Yeah, I think that's my time. So I think we may either have some time for questions, or someone is after me. I'm not really sure, but
No, we will have time for questions afterward, but now it is my great honor to present the Scotland's Minister for Environment and Land Reform. Please.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. And I should just like to begin by saying thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today at this vital summit, at this critical time, and in our beautiful city of Glasgow, a city which is in fact the closest to the Arctic Circle ever to have hosted COP. And while not quite geographically an Arctic nation, is the most northerly non-Arctic country. In fact, the Shetland Isles in Scotland are on the same latitude as Cape Farewell in Greenland, and they are closer to the Arctic Circle than London. But of course, it's not just our geographical proximity which makes us good friends and neighbours. It's about the ambitions that we share. So in 2019, we published our first Arctic policy, which was called Arctic Connections. And in that, we tried to foster more of the connections, seek closer cooperation, and crucially, to cooperate on the shared challenges that we face, including, of course, the shared challenge of climate change. Now, we know, and some of the speakers that have preceded me today have set out so clearly how climate change and nature loss are the single greatest long-term threats that we face, and that it is no exaggeration to say that the future of our planet and everything living on it depends on concerted action and action taking now. And it's in the face of that enormous challenge that initiatives such as 50 by 30 are so important. Because none of you here need to be reminded of the centrality of the polar regions in the fight against climate change. With Arctic warming happening twice as quickly than other parts of the world, we in Scotland care deeply about this. We care because it affects our friends and neighbours. We care because it affects us with our coastal communities at risk from rising sea levels. And we care because of the severity of what that means for the world. And the speakers have set out that severity so clearly today. So the scale of the challenge and the pace with which we need to move means that collaboration is essential, and that the input from these fantastic scientific minds is also essential. There are rapid and profound changes that are already underway, and we are very proud of Scotland's contribution in our science and research industries, who have helped drive forward the science behind all this work. Indeed, 7 Scottish universities are members of the University of the Arctic, and through the Scottish Alliance of Geoscience, Environment and Society, Scotland is home to Europe's largest glaciology group. We also in the Scottish Government recently confirmed support for new academic networks in Scotland to foster even stronger links with the Arctic, and several projects which will be funded through our new Arctic Connections Fund will see Scottish universities and academics collaborating with colleagues across the Arctic region, both on climate change and on the imperative of a just transition. These scientific minds and this collaboration will be absolutely central to meeting the challenges that we face, but equally to rising to the opportunities that this can have for our communities. And as we collaborate internationally, as we must, Scotland is also trying its very best to lead at home. And Ryan set out really thoroughly a lot of what we're doing in Scotland. In fact, it was quite interesting to have been part of the development of the climate change plan and then to sit and listen to someone far more scientific than me explain it. But just to recap, we are keen not only to be deeply ambitious, but to be able to move quickly. So we announced a climate emergency in 2019. And our Parliament moved very quickly thereafter to set the our Climate Change Act, which sets what we think is the most ambitious framework for emissions reduction in the world. and some of the aspects of that were set out. So just to recap, it's net zero by 2045, it's a 75% reduction by 2030. And crucially, there are annual targets in between with a catch-up mechanism, which means that if we miss them, as ambitious targets sadly sometimes are missed, we then have to report on how we will catch up on that. And also, interestingly, all of that statute is underpinned by a legal commitment to a just transition, which means that as we pursue these world-leading targets, we will do so in a way that leaves no one behind, no community behind. We will take everybody with us. And we are making progress. We have already reduced our emissions by 51% since the 1990 baseline. Last year, 96%, nearly all of our gross electricity use came from renewable sources. And in my area, as Minister for Environment, we're very fortunate to have ample resources in our natural world to draw upon as nature-based solutions to climate change. So we are planting 80% of the UK's trees in Scotland, and we're investing heavily in restoring our precious peatlands. Who would have thought the answers to the great challenges of the age will lie in the mud in northern Scotland? But it's amazing the way that they will sequester carbon, support biodiversity, and we hope create good green jobs in our rural communities, which of course is part of our just transition plans. And all of that is set out in our nationally determined contribution, which we took the step to produce prior to hosting COP. So with all that in mind, I am so delighted, truly, to accept your very kind invitation for Scotland to join the 50 by 30 coalition. We are so proud of the progress that we've made to date, but we are crystal clear that there is so much work still to do. And we're clear that collaboration has to be at the heart of that. The road to net zero, it is going to be very challenging, but it's a road that we absolutely have to walk together. Because, as has so eloquently been set out in the 50 by 30 mission statement, we cannot negotiate with the melting point of ice. So thank you all very, very much, and I hope to continue working with you.
Thank you so much for that very welcome declaration. I'm especially impressed, I have to say. I was not aware of the yearly targets and the catch-up mechanism, because that's so important for other governments, especially at this COP, to really implement those kinds of policies. If there are questions, are there any questions from either of the hubs? Okay. Any questions online? Okay, so if there are questions from the audience, then if you would come to this microphone, we'll activate it. And we're quite eager to hear from any of you. Yeah. So if I might ask a question then, could you talk a little bit more then about this catch-up mechanism and how that would work, how the annual targets would work? That would be really interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to talk about the catch-up mechanism, and we'll start by saying, unfortunately, we have had to utilise it, which is unfortunate, but I think it demonstrates the importance of why it's there. So we have met a number of our annual targets. We have missed a number. Crucially in that, I think something that I take great comfort in is that there is a lag in the data, so that so much of what we did this year isn't captured. But where we miss them, the Scottish Government is required to present to Parliament a plan, much like the climate change plan that you've been studying, which demonstrates how the emissions gap will be closed between what was the target and where we eventually came in that year. And we did miss the most recent target, and therefore just a number of weeks before COP26, we laid in the Scottish Parliament a catch-up report, which demonstrates how we'll make the gap. So there's something about, being exceptionally ambitious does mean that there won't always be times when we will meet our objectives, but it's not a reason to stop, and we just have to keep pushing on. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd say that's actually a very welcome addition to the 50 by 30 reason in many ways of being an example. All of the 50 by 30 consistent governments have actually climate committees or something along those lines that are benchmarking groups that say whether or not a government is on track. But in most cases, such as the UK, for example, they're often saying the government is not on track, but there's no mechanism built into the law to bring it back on track again. So I think that's a really needed innovation. So if there are, questions, 2 questions.
Yeah, I was an author of the IPCC report, and I also sit on the UK government climate change committee. But I've got the question I've got is, what about kind of differential kind of responsibility by trying to set this 50 by 30 target? You're really excluding a lot of the developing countries. I mean, you really can't kind of paint different countries with exactly the same kind of targets. So I just wonder what you can try and do to kind of bring those developing countries in.
And I'm happy to hear more from Ryan on this as well. Joeri would have been good, but basically part of the reason for that is that the analysis needs to be done on those countries, number one. Number two is that to be 1.5 consistent, we feel like it's important for the industrialized nations, for those few who are 1.5 consistent, to be raised up, because I think a lot of people are hearing in the media and elsewhere, and we see this especially in the cryosphere world, people will say, well, we've lost the Arctic, or there's no way to make 1.5 degrees. So part of what we're trying to do is lift up the industrialized nations and saying that it is possible. And this is how it's been done. This is how it can be done. But I agree with you. I think it's equally important to lift up developing countries to say, and this is how developing countries can do this. And a lot of that, of course, is finance. And that's one of the biggest issues at this COP. So please, yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for very fascinating presentation. My name is Halla Loadóttir. I'm a co-founder of the Arctic Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Director General of Iceland's National Energy Authority. And I'm curious, when in implementation of your ambitious plan, can you speak a bit about the challenges, for an example, related to siting of energy projects in the context of wind energy and so forth, and how you're tackling the differences that come along with finding and implementing solutions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent question. I think it goes back to that point that I made before, that the scale of what we're facing and the speed that we need to address it in, and I don't mind admitting, is not something that government is actually used to acting as nimbly and as quickly to respond to. So that in and of itself is a challenge. And I think my colleagues in the Scottish Government would agree that since the declaration of the climate emergency, there has been a real step change in the way that our directorates work to consider everything that we're doing, be it in health, be it in the transport department, be it in food and agriculture, challenging ourselves on what we're doing. But on the ground, and I was saying this morning, one of the great joys of being a minister is that you're also a member of parliament, and your job is to be in your constituency and speaking to people. And one of the greatest challenges is about the way that it affects people in their everyday life. And especially, for example, in oil and gas, as we have made very clear that continued unlimited extraction of hydrocarbons is not in line with our climate goals. And therefore, our oil and gas industry has to change rapidly and change fairly. So that comes back to our commitment to a just transition. One of the biggest challenges will be moving quickly enough, but doing it in a way that's fair to our people, doesn't create economic dislocation, examples of which are still felt throughout Scotland from when we last had a big shift when our steelworks and our coal mines closed in the 80s and 90s. So it's that balance of sufficiently ambitious and doing it in a way that is fair and takes everybody with us. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will add on to this that we actually are having a side event during week 2 on Thursday that is focused on the just transition. The minister's counterpart for a just transition will be taking part in that event, and we look forward to hosting it. So if there are no more questions, we'll, one more question, please, Twyla.
Yeah. I'm Twyla Moon. I'm a cryosphere scientist. I study the Greenland ice sheet in the Arctic, and I'm just so pleased to hear from you and to welcome Scotland to the 50 by 30 coalition. It feels truly fantastic. And what I would like to hear is your thoughts as far as scientists. We're so close to the information and kind of an awareness of what the possibilities of the future could hold. How wonderful it could be if we are all to take the ambitious actions that are possible, and the world that we could live in. But we don't always know kind of where to find the people to bring on board. And I wonder, for you, who are the people that you would like to be becoming more familiar with the science and the possibilities? Is it policy or business or perhaps constituents and the public? Where would you like to see us stretching our wings and trying our best to communicate?
Thank you so much for your question. It's lovely to meet you as well. I think that, first of all, as scientists, the answers to so much of this are in your minds. So we're so grateful to have you. But I also acknowledge that it must be so burdensome, actually, because one of your colleagues said he'd been studying ice for 40 years. You have known about this impending situation for such a long time. In all its complexity, you've understood that. So it must be a relief somewhat that now I think public consciousness is starting to pick up. And I hope you feel that we're at a better time than ever to take action on that. But you're right. I think the biggest challenge is probably twofold. One is translating the science in a way that is understandable to the public at large. And I think probably politicians have got a role to do in that, because we are that interface between policy development and the public. And we've got a job to engage and to reach out. And one of the things that we've done in Scotland is we hosted a citizens' assembly, which invited people randomly from all over the country to come together and to assess what we could do in climate objectives in every single, right across our economy and society. And they gave us a very fulsome report, and we're now considering how we can implement it. And that to me was really important, because it said, this is what the public say they want us to do. And actually very much it was about not allowing it to fall on the shoulders of the individual and calling to business, which is the second point. We absolutely have to encourage business and the private sector to lead the way, because the government can't do this alone. The public sector can't do this alone, not just in our position of influence, but equally with funding. So we need to demonstrate to business not just the risks of inaction, but the opportunities of action. And that's something that we're also trying to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming to this event. We're so pleased to welcome Scotland to the 50 by 30 Coalition. And please check out the entire program of the pavilion at www.icccinet.org. And it's on the homepage there. You can look at every day and watch it online, as well as welcome to come here to the pavilion also. So thank you very much. Thank you, Minister.